Hello and welcome to another podcast, and today we're going to be talking all about whether we should stop calorie counting. Calorie counting can be something that we can really use as part of our recovery journey to help us to make sure we're eating enough, to really look after ourselves, but it also can be something that can become a real crux, a huge part of the eating disorder and a really difficult part of the eating disorder to let go of. So today we're going to be talking about how calorie counting can be beneficial in recovery, when it isn't beneficial, and then what do we do about it when we decide that maybe it's not the right thing for us to be doing anymore and actually stop calorie counting. So first of all, when can it be useful? Quite often, if clients come to me and they are already calorie counting, I don't suggest starting if you haven't started yet, or if you've given up before, it's not a good reason to start again. You know, there are lots of other things that we can do to help people in the earlier stages of recovery. But if you are in the earlier stages of recovery and you're already calorie counting, then it's something that we can use to really make sure that you're having enough to eat, making sure your intake is sufficient, suitable for you and your needs before you're able to tap into those hunger and fullness cues. Quite often when we've been relying on calorie counting for a really long time, and actually generally the public in general, we're quite disconnected from our hunger and fullness. We disconnect from our bodies generally because we don't want to feel stuff. We try not to feel tired, exhausted, all the big feelings that we feel also as empaths. And that also shuts us off oftentimes from the hunger and fullness cues that we have, and even if we do feel them, we don't necessarily trust them because of the eating disorder. So actually using those as a way to increase our intake and making sure that we're getting enough food in is a really helpful way for us to use calories earlier on in recovery. Noticing that, for example, if clients have been working with me for a period of time, or maybe they have noticed themselves after a period of being recovered or being in quite a good place for a while, that they're just not feeling great, knowing that they may be feeling a little bit low energy, maybe feeling a little bit run down. Can be useful then to sit down and do a little bit of a sense check as a real one-off, and we've put boundaries around that as well, obviously, to make sure that we're just doing it to make sure that we really are supporting ourselves. If we've been poorly, if we've had a sickness bug, if we have gone through a period of high stress at work, we can become a little bit disconnected from those hunger and fullness cues. Again, that's a time when we want to really boundary around calorie counting for ourselves, so we don't pick up the habit again, because that can be something that we can fall back into. But it can be a tool to make sure that we are getting enough energy in. But beyond that, really, calorie counting just becomes a way of our eating disorder to stay in control, and a big reason why actually people get stuck in quasi-recovery, also known as quasi-recovery. I don't know if I pronounce it right. You talk about it all these years and I still pronounce it the way that I think it should be. If you haven't heard about quasi-recovery before, basically it's a bit of a halfway house in recovery. Likely when people in quasi-recovery, they've had a restrictive eating disorder in the past, and they're doing better. Their weight may be higher, they may be more flexible around food, they might feel less guilt, less food anxiety, they might worry about what they look like less, but those things are still very much running underneath the surface, and everything's okay as long as they stick within the boundaries that the eating disorder feels comfortable with. So what we're saying really is that the boundaries really have, and the food rules and the calorie rules and weight stuff has all just shifted up really to a healthier point. But in an ideal world, we don't want to be using them at all. We don't want to be having those thoughts, we don't want to be feeling those things. We want to have full food freedom and full trust in our body so that we can just crack on and live an amazing life. Recovery isn't about surviving and existing and being able to stay alive, which we can do in quasi-recovery. Full recovery really is about having the space to get our lives back, free from all of the rubbish that comes with eating disorders. So in quasi-recovery, we're kind of in this whole halfway house where we're not as bad as we were, but we're not also fully recovered. And it's possible for people to get stuck there for a long time, and it's a real shame because it doesn't really leave the space for an amazing life, because we're still going to be really dysregulated. Our nervous system's going to be really dysregulated because we're underfueled, because we're following all these rules. We're still going to be really disconnected from our body. We're not really processing all these emotions. Like, there's a lot of like detrimental stuff which comes from staying in carzo recovery, as well as not having like the life of your dreams, because ideally we don't want to have an eating disorder, right? So it's really important that we start to wean ourselves off calorie counting, if that's something that you're struggling with. And the first thing I always say with any behaviour is asking ourselves, what is it actually doing for us? Now, if you listen to my podcast about the 5 human needs, definitely would go and check that out, because I'm going to talk a bit about it. And one of the particular needs I talked about, which is safety and control. This is a huge part of an eating disorder, and a huge part also of the anxiety that quite often exists for a lot of us that have had eating disorders, have eating disorders. And as I said, the calorie counting becomes a real control mechanism for the eating disorder, and ultimately we kind of feel safe as long as we're within those rules. It provides a real sense of safety, a real sense of control. And as always, where clinically possible, it's not always clinically possible, we want to add before we take away. So when we're talking about adding before taking away, in this sense, we're talking about adding ways of ourselves feeling safer, feeling in control without before we even look at taking away the calorie counting. So this could mean doing some deep breathing, doing some nervous system regulation practices. This could be creating healthy structure in other ways. Maybe shifting from calorie counting to I use something called My Menu with my clients, which basically gives like multiple options for each meal. That can be a step away. So we're looking at still creating that structure, but not being as rigid with it. And just making sure that we create that safety and that sense of control in another way first. We want to add before we take away. That nervous system regulation is a huge part of this, particularly with those of us that feel unsafe, unless we're in control. And that quite often is a trauma response. Most of my clients I work with and people come across with long-term eating disorders have experienced trauma, whether complex PTSD, which they might not even realise they have because it's happened within the household, and they haven't even realised that the behaviour their parents had might not have been normal. Anyway, I won't go into trauma too much, but it's really common for us to have dysregulated nervous systems and have a real difficulty creating safety for ourselves because we have experienced maybe trauma in childhood. So adding safety in before we take something away, a mechanism away, is really important. In terms of practical tips, learning to check into your hunger and fullness cues and paying attention to even those mental hunger cues. I have a resource available for hunger and fullness. If you drop me a message on Instagram or Facebook and just say hunger and fullness, I will send you my hunger and fullness chart. But also remembering that they're not just physical cues. Hunger can present in lots of other ways, that loss of focus that we can have, the feeling of feeling like we're lightheaded, feeling like we're thinking about food. Thinking about food is a sign of hunger. It's a way our brain tells us that actually we've stopped listening to the stomach. We need you to actually do something about this now. That fantasizing about food, wanting to read cookbooks, cook for other people, is a sign of mental hunger. That's a sign that you're undernourished and a sign that you need to eat. Clock watching, again, a sign that you need to eat. So learning to pay attention to those hunger and fullness cues, particularly mental hunger cues and physical hunger cues. The fullness is something we tend to be much better at picking up. Deleting calorie counting apps, and instead, maybe if you have them, instead counting calories round into the nearest 50, 100, depending on where you're at with calorie counting already. And other things that we can do, have a meal a day or a snack a day that's pretty consistent and just not tracking it. Knowing what your total should be minus that snack and just not counting it. And eventually we can remove more and more meals from that and then stop counting altogether. So there are a few tips in terms of how you can practically stop calorie counting. But it's really key that when we're doing this, we're still making sure we're having enough. Because if we're doing it without addressing the root causes, that's when we can actually start to remove calorie counting and start to question everything that we're having and under fueling ourselves. As part of the move away from calorie counting, we really need to sort the hunger and fullness bit out first and be really mindful of that hunger and fullness. Make sure that we're consistently eating enough when we are counting calories. Otherwise, we're really going to fall into that anxiety is going to make us restrict more sort of cycle, and we get more anxious, we restrict more, and therefore we experience more mental hunger, we experience more anxiety because our nervous system is going to be dysregulated because they're underfueled, and so we eat less, and so we get more anxious, and so we eat less, and so we get more anxious, and then the cycle continues. So making sure before you look at stopping calorie counting that you're eating enough, you're able to pay attention to those mental hunger and fullness cues, and have got really good at that first, and then slowly weaning yourself off. It's really easy for us to be all or nothing people and just go, right, I'm going to stop today. And that's actually not really good for us, because that's when, as I said, that anxiety loop can really start. So it really is a process, and obviously ideally it's something that you are better doing working with somebody, because they'll be able to catch things that you won't be able to catch, maybe work with you on some meal structures and some alternative approaches that might be more suitable for you. But hopefully that's been helpful today in thinking about whether calorie counting is serving you, how it can serve you, and actually when it really, really doesn't. And most of the time it really doesn't, and it's just about making sure that we wean ourselves off in a way that is safe and conducive to us continuing in recovery rather than slipping backwards. So I'll leave it there for today. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you on the next podcast.